Bennett. He's a professor of history at the Graduate Center at the University, at NYU. Very, very good friend of ours, an alum. As a matter of fact, he's one of those persons who, when you look around at some of the changes that have taken place here at UNC, he was one of those students who was out raising his voice to try to make things better here for students, everyone, particularly those who came after him. In his new book, African Kings and Black Slaves, he mines the historical archives of Europe and Africa to interpret the first century of sustained African-European interaction. And that's a very important point as we go into this very important year-long celebration that's going to actually, I think, most people begin in the fall, that looks at the ways that this institution of slavery has marked this country and many other countries around the world, for better or worse, most likely worse. These encounters were not simply economic transactions, rather, according to Bennett, they involved clashing in understandings of diplomacy, sovereignty, and politics. I'm sure many of you are going to have a good number of questions, so I'm not going to say too much. The only thing that I will ask you to do, for those of you who need papers signed to attest that you were in fact here, Mr. Drame in the back of the blue or myself will do that for you. And also, you also have a evaluation form that you were given if you will also be sure to fill that evaluation form and give it to us before you leave. So without further ado, I'd like to bring Professor Bennett up because I want to give him more time to talk than I talk. And I also want you to get a sense of the depth of the work that he's placed into this endeavor and why I believe it's going to be something that's going to be winning a lot of awards. I've already nominated him for one. He doesn't know that.
Wow. So I'm not sure, are all of you in the audience, there are like multiple publics here. There's the empty public, and then there's the intermediate public, and then there's just table public, and then there's the lounge chair public. And so I welcome those of you, to join the empty public up here, but I do sort of imagine it could be ghosts of various sorts who are sitting up here and filling up these seats. It's, I want to just take 1 second before I get into the formal aspects of my talk. And one of the things I'm doing, because I notice most of you are students, and I want to be very clear that there's a reason why I'm actually attentive to the talk here, because language really matters to me, and language is going to make and plays a significant role in the kind of project that sort of informs this book, right? I'm going to be making a larger case about a library, about the colonial library, and about certain kind of reading practices, and about lingering. And lingering actually requires us to sort of be attentive to like language and detail and so on. Because part of the story that I'm telling here is one that is oftentimes lost to us because of our rush, because of the ways in which we rush and we hurry, and we sort of think that we already know something about this particular story, and yet my specific point is methodologically, but also politically and epistemologically, precisely because we're in such a rush that we assume that we know all this, that we don't linger, we don't sort of spend a lot of time focusing on language. And that's one of the reasons why I don't actually have a PowerPoint. I mean, this lends itself to a PowerPoint in some really important ways, but it also lends itself to just listening and being attentive to the language that I'm going to materialize. It's good to be home. This is one of my mini homes, and this is a particular home in which Gordon was pointing out, it's a particular kind of, it's a home in which I learned about politics, and I learned about a certain kind of, a certain way of being in the world. And in fact, it's amazing just sort of looking down here in the pit and thinking about how much of what I wrote here is in fact produced by, by some of the kinds of conversations that were happening around this pit and the politics of the undergraduate library, which is now 50 years old. No joke. People, there was a seriousness to being here, and I'm sure it's here today and it continues to be. So it's very good to be here. Years ago, on entering Portugal's National Archive, an exhibit on early modern exploration caught my eye. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. It was 1998, 6 years after Spain had commemorated the anniversary of Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage. Perusing the contents of the exhibit, one could not but notice the scrolls, papyri, embellished and laminated text announcing far more than the vastness of Portuguese exploration. The Portuguese court, the royal court that is, received the inhabitants of northern and eastern Africa, west central Africa, the Middle East, South and East Asian notables as notables, dignitaries who, on delivering their respective sovereigns' correspondence, enjoyed the protective status of emissaries. In this enactment of Renaissance diplomacy, the various texts, these correspondence, on display reflected a rhetorical protocol steeped in ornate forms of address. They, the emissaries, stood and spoke as equals, a status conveyed by lords, emirs, negus, emperors, pashas, manikandos, and princes throughout the detailed invocation of their royal titles. Pressed for time, I pushed on and into the archive, but not before a long look at the letters crafted in Amharic that Ethiopia's ruler addressed to his Christian brother and peer, the Portuguese sovereign. The contemporary representations shared by the conventional representations shared by contemporary Africans and their global descendants regarding the early modern European encounter with the larger world is troubled by this correspondence. We are not accustomed to seeing Europeans supporting Africans this kind of diplomatic respect. In the popular narrative, defined by conquest, colonial imposition, possession and dispossession, what role, if any, did this correspondence, saturated with royal titles, play? The titles did not matter. Why were all the parties involved constantly invoking them? In the eyes of the Europeans, what function did they serve? How might these titles reveal something different about a well-known past typified by the easy juxtaposition of conquerors and conquered, winners and victims, colonizers and colonized, masters and slaves? Our foundational premise surrounding these juxtaposition resides in the abject and violated body of the enslaved, an object unmoored and alienated from all pre-existing social ties. Objectification, always already conceived as secular in form, does not engender inquiry into a previous status, much less exploration of a moment seemingly defined by the mutual recognition of the importance of diplomatic protocol. The history of enslavement forecloses an engagement with the past, as it constitutes the slave as an epistemic object of the here, now, and future. Simply as stated, a master was a master and a slave a slave. But language matters, and as a historian of Africans, I was keen on knowing if the use of royal terminology, right, in the text was more than just a dismissive gesture of African clownishness and culpability. I felt compelled to ask whether or not these descriptions were related to a grammar of politics that perhaps informed both Europe's encounter with Africa and the subsequent histories that unfolded. Further, what role, if any, did the acknowledged existence of the political in Africa play in shaping articulations of statecraft in Europe, right? Articulations of statecraft in Europe. To which a final related question has been added. How might this political grammar be illustrative of pasts that have been lost to us under the subsequent weight of successive colonial impositions and our restricted political imaginations? So I'm just saying a lot here that I'm going to unpack over the course of this talk but most of it is a kind of unpacking and layering. In African Kings and Black Slaves, Sovereignty and Dispossession in the Early Modern Atlantic, I used the terminology of the letters as a starting point and soon understood the pervasiveness with which European chroniclers and travel writers employed Iberian royal tropes to describe the earliest encounters with Africans. Royalty saturated the landscape. With this awareness, I re-immersed myself in the familiar travel logs and chronicles describing the European encounter with Africans. It is immediately clear that the terminology forms a corpus, a register, if you will, questioning the idea of a hermetically sealed European ascendancy, one from which the slave trades emerged and devolved in the absence of political negotiations, driven only by force and commodification, in which tenuous market relations were market driven. In pondering the ubiquitous use of royal terminology, I'm asking how might one read this phenomenon as an acknowledgement of African sovereignty that was simultaneously constitutive of early modern imperial statecraft, or early modern Iberian statecraft. Though my focus on the Europeans' pervasive deployment of royal terminology in reference to African sovereigns, I intentionally relied on narrative literature composed of chronicles and travelogues that has been foundational to the framing the earliest encounter between Africans and Europeans. In those documents, familiar to the point of being overlooked, conventional, it is possible to glimpse traces of a past that tacked between African and European history, which begs for a reconsideration of the early modern African diaspora, Atlantic history, and the New World's origin story of blackness. The interpretive practice, and I'm coming back to this question of the colonial library that I sort of started off in the beginning of my informal remarks. The interpretive practice of rereading the early modern colonial library for evidence, understandings, and events, complicating the inaugural moments of the European expansion, engenders an origin story still in need of being conceived, and has implications for how subsequent pasts unfold. While the narrative of slavery and freedom stood on the horizon, a strategic reading of the early modern colonial library also questions truths bequeathed to us from a subsequent liberal era that to this day still colonize our imaginary when it comes to framing the 15th century European encounter with Africans. And such truths here are, I hope you're beginning to understand what I'm trying to get to. Such truths include the ascendancy of race in the initial encounter, the ascendancy of market relations at the initial encounter, and similarly, the idea that European statecraft preceded the existence of the European-African encounter, right? So part of the project, what I'm trying to get at here is that, let's start with the third one. Part of the project is to sort of suggest that when we think of political theory, we think of European political formations. And those of you who are in a bookstore, obviously, and those of you you've heard of like Machiavelli, right? And you think of Machiavelli, and you think subsequently somebody probably not as prominent in your thinking, but another important theorist of the state is Jean Bodin, a French political theorist. And then finally, Thomas Hobbes, right? We work from this kind of assumption that those are the architects of European statecraft, and they help us think through what constitutes a European state. But those individuals are actually reading and thinking about this very same library, this encounter, and they're theorizing from these experiences that the Portuguese and the Spaniards are having in the 15th century to formulate ideas about what constitutes the political, what constitutes the state, what constitutes empire, and also the framework of sovereignty. Right? And so I'm actually trying to make a bigger case here, by making a bigger case that sort of takes on the very kind of canonical formulations of politics and political theory on the one hand, but then on the other hand, I'm also trying to grapple with, in a fundamental way, with many of your assumptions, many of our assumptions, many of the Western assumptions that sort of start that these encounters can can always already be framed as a formulation in which race is fully defined and commodification is fully defined. And so those are the kinds of truths that actually have to be unpacked, right? Have to be unpacked and worked through if we want to understand how to think about the 15th century as being a moment that isn't sort of already colonized by our thinking, by our political imaginary, that itself is captured by the 18th century. That's kind of, in a nutshell, the bigger project, right? And it's basically trying to do something like what I'm going to call, and you won't see in the talk, I'm trying to do some kind of forward thinking or forward writing, historical writing, as opposed to sort of working from our moment, our urgency now, and then allowing that to sort of colonize different eras in the past. And as a result, then also shape those eras, not just colonize them, but structure them to the point that it allows us then to overlook, to ignore, to neglect, to sort of miss details that are actually important, right? Important in terms of providing a different kind of narrative of the political, right? And for me, the political here is one in which Africa's relationship to Europe is fundamental, right? It's not just sort of an aside. It's not just an aside in terms of race. It's not just an aside in terms of commodification, but is actually fundamentally constitutive of the very way in which the West emerges, right? And so the project here is fundamentally a much bigger project to sort of say that we can't just sort of think of Africa's relationship, the European-African encounter and Africa's place in this as just somehow something secondary or tertiary, but actually is fundamental to the very way in which the West itself came about, and the very way in which Europe comes about in terms of its ideas of the political. Right? That's kind of the bigger project. That's kind of the takeaway. So I've given you the takeaway. So bear with me while I'm going to walk through this to let you see what I'm getting at. Stated less abstractly, the European encounter with Africa is generally not seen as a site of theorization with regard to the political. But the political informs every text of this encounter. Rhetoric and performances of lordship alongside legal regimes, ceremonies, and pomp are constitutive of early modern politics, both in the form of sovereign power and sovereignty. Scholars of the slave trade usually overlook these anecdotes, at best look at these anecdotes at best as curiosities that figure in cultural history, as exceptional instances that are quickly relegated to a curiosity in favor of data or abstraction in the service of telling the predictable story of slavery's ascendance. I'm intent on reading the rhetoric, the incidents, the ceremonies, and rituals embedded in the chronicles and travel accounts as political tropes. These tropes and anecdotes prominently manifest in the well-worn tomes of the colonial library demand an equally valid reading of the colonial past as it relates to Africa, Africans, and the formation of the African diaspora. Let us turn to one of these tales that emerges from the colonial library. 1448, soon after the Abyssinian priest Lucas Marcos left the court of João II, another Ethiopian delegation landed in his realm. That's of João II in Portugal. On learning of Princess Bemoi's arrival, João instructed his officials to escort the prince and his entourage of nobles and relatives to an estate just beyond Lisbon. There, in anticipation of their audience with João II, João Barros recorded that he, the prince, was treated in every respect as a sovereign lord, accustomed to our civilization and not as a barbarous prince outside of the law. I'm going to read you a little passage here in the actual text, since it is we're in the bookstore. It's like trying to be fancy, right? In their reception at court, both the king and queen extended Bemoy the highest honors of state. They commanded Francisco Coutinho, Count of Marivela, to escort Bemoy to the court and in the company of noblemen. According to Barros, Portugal's sovereigns greeted Bemoy's arrival with great ceremony and pageantry, each of them with their household, the king in the state room and a high dais with a canopy of rich brocade, accompanied by the Duke Beja, Don Manuel, brother of the king, counts, bishops, and other notable persons, with the queen With the queen were Prince Alfonso, her son, and many noblemen of the court and their ladies in ceremonial dress. So I'm going to stop here for a second. That very practice, for those of you who are medievalists, for those of you who are thinking about becoming medievalists or early modernists, right? That very kind of listing of assemblies, that very thing, as a medievalist or as an early modernist, that's a manifestation of how one understands the politics, how one writes about politics in medieval history, right? It's known as an assembly, right? Like who was present, why were those people present, what were the gestures that they engage in, right? So here's a moment in which we're taking a very canonical European text or travel log in which they're performing a kind of European politics, and at the same time we have to think about that this is actually being done in relationship to the presence of an African prince, right? And so that, normally we see these kinds of assemblies, right? These assemblies, and they're read by medievalists as a way of saying like how important an event was within the context of a specific court, within the context of a specific chronicle. So I want you to understand that particular kind of practice there, which we oftentimes just dismiss as, oh, okay, here's a European meeting an African prince, rather than focusing on the details. That's what I'm saying about lingering, focusing on a kind of slow reading, sort of in the language of the young folks today, to slow your roll, in fact, to actually be particular about the source at hand. On entering the stateroom, Joao ventured in Beaumoy's direction, and Beaumoy in turn assumed a prostrate position at the king's feet, making as though he took the earth from under them and threw it over his head in token of humility and obedience. Moved by this display, Joao motioned Beaumoy to stand while he walked back and leaned on his throne, a ritual gesture in his own right. Then Joao instructed the interpreter that Beaumoy should state what brought him to Portugal. Barros observed that Beaumoy delivered his speech with such poise and elegance that he did not seem like a Negro, but a prince worthy of all respect. Evidently, Joao thought so as well. Though Joao made Beaumoy Christian conversion the condition for military resistance, he eventually placed 20 caravels at the Wolof sovereign's disposal. And the expedition ended in failure, since the Portuguese commander eventually coldly assassinated Beaumoy on the Guinea coast. But this episode, filled with ceremonial affairs of state, underscores how even Joao II, the purported Lord of Guinea, recognized that laws of nation and sovereignty extended to the region's actual sovereigns, or actual kings and lords. And I'm going to spend a little more time coming back to these particular kind of evidence, right? Because what I want to deal with is the ambiguity of this, right? I want to sort of think about it that on the one hand, we have the outcome, which it didn't end up well, because ultimately Prince Beaumoy winds up being assassinated on the coast of Guinea. But along the way, there's a whole bunch of other details that we have to actually take into consideration, think about as a way of sort of making sense of a story about what happens with this individual at the court before he actually winds up in the field and eventually assassinated on the coastline. And there's a way in which our thinking oftentimes is just to look at the outcome as opposed to thinking about process along the way. And I want us to sort of be attentive, because not all of these instances wind up with a similar outcome as we'll hear. So considering, and I want to think about give you another example of a reading here. Consider the following spectacle. In 1441, building on years of previous Portuguese trading and hunting and fishing expeditions that scoured the Atlantic coastline south of Cape Bajador, a small fleet of caravels anchored at Lagos on the southern coast of the southern Portuguese coast. As the returning crew discharged their cargo in the presence of Infante Dom Enrique, popularly known as Henry the Navigator, the spectacle of the handful of captives drew the attention of the royal party. Though few in number, the captives sparked expectation. Recalling this event and anticipating the future it foretold, the royal chronicler Gomez de Zorara speculated about royal sentiment. May we not think thou did feel joy, Zorara conjectured, about the prince's reaction. not so much for the number of captives taken, as for the hope thou did conceive of the others thou could have taken. In projecting royal will, the chronicler envisioned how the prince's imaginary transformed captives into slaves, while conjuring a robust slave trade into existence. Zurara was quick, however, to add that the prince was not unduly focused on wealth accruing from the trade in slaves. Thou joy, observed the chronicler, was solely from one holy purpose, to seek salvation for the lost souls of the heathen. Enslavement afforded the captives salvation and true freedom. And yet, wrote the chronicler, the greater benefit was theirs, for though their bodies were now brought into subjection, that was a small matter in comparison of their souls, which would now possess true freedom forevermore. One could easily dismiss Zurara's musings about the soul, salvation, true freedom as ideology at work, which, in fact, it was. But an undue focus on ideology privileges secular skepticism at the expense of faith, reduces Christianity to an instrument of power, and has caused scholars to lose sight of Catholicism's formidable yet layered political history with regard to Africans. There is an iconic image of the slave trade in which the solitary priest baptized enslaved masses of Africans as their captors compelled them on board. And while scholarship on the Catholic encounter has transcended this image, we need to grapple carefully with what it meant then. Catholic missions, though sparse, were an established reality in a number of 15th and 16th century West and West Central African kingdoms. Catholicism had acquired considerable depth because African converts, notably the elites, but also commoners, had transformed it into an indigenous phenomenon. While the earliest missions, especially among the Congo peoples, have attracted scholarly attention, we still have yet to fully consider Christianity's institutional and intellectual complexity, which sanctioned the presence of the priest and insinuated Catholicism into Africa. Even if we concede the limited role that the Church's conscience played in this process, one needs to ponder the efficacy of scripture, theology, papal nuncios, the particular of church-state relations, and Christian relations with the extra-ecclesiam, that is, those who are human but outside of the existing faith. That's just a very flat-footed definition of the extra-ecclesiam. To acknowledge that the iconic imaginary priest and his gestures were superficial should not foreclose an examination of the institutional mechanisms and intellectual traditions that mediated the Catholic encounter with Africa and Africans. Doing so requires that we understand that in the eyes of the Church, the priest's presence transcended the issue of Christian conscience. Catholicism was a manifestation of statecraft. Church-state relations, theology, papal authority, papal bulls, church canons, and canon law all came to the fore when medieval Christians encountered infidels or pagans. In overlooking Catholicism's institutional history and its related intellectual currents, we have lost sight of a tradition of Christian politics that brought into relief the simultaneity of early modern African and European sovereignty, which perhaps offers a more complicated explanation for why the priest stood at the key. Here I want to suggest how and under what circumstances Catholic dogma, institutions, and law mattered in the European encounter with Africa. This history magnifies a field of politics concerning early modern sovereignty that culminated in a taxonomy of African difference, which in turn rendered the inhabitants of some polities, not all polities, but some polities, into slaves. Even prior to the systematization of the slave trade and slavery, which only 2 centuries later would be firmly linked with people of African descent, we see how Christianity mediated encounters with pagan polities. These encounters were marked not by a confident reliance on European superiority, but rather on mutual recognition that navigating such encounters required careful diplomacy. Such maneuvers shaped both the encounter itself, but also the self-conscious performance of state power on both sides of the encounter. To say as much calls into question the telos that has long served to absorb has long absorbed the African-European encounter and its immediate history into the story of New World slavery, thereby overlooking the part that Africa and Africans played in the evolution of Iberian sovereignty and imperial identity prior to 1492. Scholars rarely reflect on the earliest sequence of events involving Iberians interacting with African polities, and how that history might trouble the existing narrative of the West and its emergence. Instead, the emphasis has been on the inauguration of the slave trade and slavery, and how the slave trade unfolds in the economic and social histories of the Americas. The iconic yet imaginary priest location symbolically delineated the boundaries between an African polity and the beginnings of a Christian jurisdiction are rather tenuous. Yet, this location, or his location, the priest's location, his presence, points to a site of metamorphosis, a place where elites, buyers, and owners reduced Africans, or at least some Africans, into slaves. This is a sleight of hand quite familiar to scholars of slavery and to the slave trade. After all, trade signified the existence of sovereign authority, both African and European, which in turn highlighted an often overlooked Christian intellectual and institutional legacy, which, like the imaginary priest's presence, scholars and popular lore usually reduce to ideological contortions. In reducing the earliest encounter with Africa to the slave trade and slavery, we have lost sight of a distinct narrative of power in which Africans stood for more than objects acted upon. What I argue in African kings and black slaves is not an assertion of African agency. I'm interested in the implications that this past might have for narrating the history of Europe, among other things. The narrative of power historians and theorists associate with the West has woefully under-examined and under-theorized the African presence. This presence, I argue, comprises a site yet to be examined for its role in Western formation, a history in which Africa and Africans figured as objects, yes, but occasionally also emerge as historical subjects. In the hands of scholars whose eyes are fixed on the emergence of the slave trade, Africans rarely emerge from the earliest narratives of the Portuguese and Spanish past beyond the status of chattel, already detached from what in modern terms might be described as the political. Consequently, the objects of the slave trade and slavery enter history, i.e. the European past, devoid of any claims, ties, and associations that have positioned them as subjects, clients, and vassals of African lords and elites whose own status fluctuated over time. From this perspective, it is easy to imagine and project natal alienation, social death, as a timeless phenomenon rather than as a dramatic, historicizing act involving force and violence that sundered roots into rootlessness. What is more, we ascribe a hegemonic singularity to the early modern European past. Despite what we fully know to be the role of the Catholic Church and Christian ideology in the encounter, Europe, in its relationship to Africa, is always already a secular and dominant, fully forged entity with a singular political rationale. And I hope you understand that that's actually what I'm hoping, that I'm trying to question in this whole framework, right? And another way to ask that would be, when was Europe, right? And part of the project here is to sort of say, it wasn't at this particular moment. It actually emerges through at a different moment. Europe in this configuration of the past is already the West rather than an entity or an idea that emerges through time and through its encounters with Africa. From these aforementioned observations flow an assertion. Until Europe is understood in its historical specificity, neither its early modern encounter with Africa nor its African encounters with Europe can be fully realized. We understand the unrelenting violence violence unleashed by Europe in its encroachment on Africa. Violence that highlights the Janus face at the core of modern life. But this representation also flattens and condenses a complex past that grants Europeans far too much power. For Africa and Africans, and the African diaspora, the stakes are considerable. Concepts like tradition, authenticity, autonomy, cultural memory, agency, and resistance, which always acquired valence through analogy and negation in the wake of encounters, cannot be conceived in their complexity until the historical specificity of the European past is clarified. As a post-colonial project, or a post-colonial historical intervention, but also a history that acknowledged the complex entanglement with Africa and Africans in the making of the European social formation, I point here to the need for an elaboration of an earlier European past as a necessary condition for writing histories of both the early modern and contemporary African diaspora. In present-day Ghana, Elmina to be exact, long before Ashanti ascendancy, or the earlier Anlo Ewe arrival, an African lord approached a group of recently landed strangers. In a magical landscape inhabited by gods, royalty, the living, and the dead, the majesty of form engendered through coronations, processions, and sacred rituals constituted far more than a minor affair. At that moment, which the Portuguese associated with 1481, but whose reckoning for local Africans remains obscured in distinct cultural configurations of the past, the Lord encountered the largest contingent of Europeans ever to set foot in the land of Guinea. More specifically, the Portuguese called the land jutting into the Atlantic on which they hoped to erect a fort so as to secure access to the inland gold trade, Elmina, literally the mine. As he greeted the strangers, the Caramansa made clear that he held their lives in his hands and also enacted his omnipotence over the local inhabitants. Hours earlier, the Portuguese commander, Diego de Anzambuja, had pressed his factors both to secure permission to land and for an audience with the reigning lord, whose title was Caramansa, though the Portuguese initially mistook this to be his name. Now, the new arrivals stood in formation, awaiting their host, Lord Caramansa. Even if de Azambuja extended the request as a routine formality, his gesture of requesting permission, especially in view of the larger contingent of Christians present, acknowledged Caramansa's dominion. After decades of fleeting contact, sovereigns from Mina and those whose dominion extended to West African and West African coast still demanded respect for their positions as landlords and lords, respect that the Portuguese accorded. Diplomacy in the form of discernible gestures and motions facilitated trade and implicated the Portuguese and local kingship relations and rituals directed at them and local subjects. As a result of securing diplomatic recognition, one contemporary noted, the African sovereigns allowed the Portuguese to carry on their business in peace and friendliness without those warlike incursions, assaults, and robberies which happened at the beginning, end quote. As the Portuguese awaited Caramansa's arrival, the cacophony of bugles and bells and horns, which are their instruments, wrote one chronicler, announced the Lord's procession. Surrounded by an armed escort and accompanied by nobles, each trailed by two naked pages, carrying their rulers' stools and weapons, the Caramansa approached with measured poise. The Portuguese chronicler, Rui de Peña, recounted how the king came naked, and his arms and legs were covered with chains and trinkets of gold in many shapes, and countless bells and large beads of gold were hanging from the hair of his beard and his head. As the king reached the center of the Portuguese company, Diego de Azambuja descended from the makeshift platform. He reverently approached the Lord, who took his hand, only to release it so as to touch his fingers and then snap them one with the other, saying in his language, "Beri beri," which in ours means peace, peace, or so we assume. De Azambuja understood what was required of him and responded with a gesture of his own.
The African nobles accompanying the king repeated the hand-finger ritual of their lord, but, recalled Rui de Peña, the manner in which they snapped their fingers different from that of the king. Wetting their fingers in their mouths and wiping them on their chest, they cracked them from little finger to index finger, a kind of salute here given to princes, for they say that fingers can carry poison if they're not cleaned in this manner. And following this series of gestures, principals on both sides extolled rhetoric of goodwill and friendship, but also warnings. If the Portuguese acted contrary to his will, proclaimed the king, they would cause more harm to themselves than him. With the stern warning, Caramansa conveyed what rituals dramatized. As the sovereign authority, he wielded power over life and death. As sources of authority, spectacles conveyed the mystery of power embedded in lordship. Regardless of how mesmerizing the finger-snapping gestures might be to those of us schooled in the way of streetwise and complex handshakes and shoulder bumps, and trivializing symbolic enactments, if not overlooking them altogether, as scholars of Atlantic have done in relationship to Africa, results in a distorted geography of power. And I don't want you to miss what I just said, right? A handshake, a shoulder bump, a fist bump, right? We understand what that means about a form of intimacy, a form of power, a kind of recognition, a kind of acknowledgement, a kind of care, a kind of deference, a kind of submission. And I want us to think about these kinds of practices that characterize your own relationship, right? So when I see Professor Hildebrand up here later and we give each other a big hug, that's more than the handshake, right? That's about a kind of care, it's about a kind of familiarity, it's a kind of knowing, right? And I want us to think about what I'm doing here in terms of the gestures that are embedded in this particular kind of reading of this encounter here, so that it's not lost to us. In Atlantic studies and the history of the African diaspora, rarely do symbolic enactments in Africa figure as sites for theorizing about the evolving history of sovereign power. The spectacles enacted along Africa's Atlantic coast during the 15th century and beyond suggest that the region constituted a crucial site in which lordship and sovereignty came into being. Spectacles and ceremonies of encounters, along with ceremonies of possessions, repeatedly dramatized sovereignty while displaying authority over sacred knowledge, territory, and mostly people. In the 15th century, an African lord's loci of power invariably centered on the ability to marshal vassals and retainers whose fortune, status, depth, ties, or lack thereof triggered the calculus that transformed subjects into slaves. Focusing on the earliest spectacles and ceremonies recalibrates the locus of Atlantic encounters while bringing forth new domains for examining both the history of sovereignty, but also taxonomies of difference that engendered who was subject of an African lord and therefore could not be enslaved, as opposed to those who were simply a slave and could be acquired by Europeans. At one level, I'm interested in tackling and archiving performances of lordship, the ceremonies and pomp symptomatic of early modern practices of sovereignty in which Africans figured. Here, the mysteries of power, authority, and rule resided in incantations of rituals and rites, generally overlooked in the secular conceptions of power that since the 18th century have framed representations of the African-European encounter. These expressions are generally reduced to cultural traditions by the scholars that do focus on them, and yet they are more than simple manifestations of a cultural impasse. Flourishing at the moment of contact, these spectacles, even in the 15th century, reflect hybrid cultural forms composed of novel terminology, pidgin languages, currencies, sacred knowledge, and rituals. These are not just cultural effects, but instruments of power. The spectacles were in fact staged for both European consumptions and the subjects of an African lord intent on asserting autonomy in the juridical and economic periphery. In this respect, the Caramansa's opening performance constituted a multi-sided ceremony. For the African lord, the African lord focused the Europeans' gaze on his authority. Then the Portuguese directed the performance of themselves and other Christians at a distance. By these actions, the lords marshaled not just the attention of the Portuguese, but that of his subjects while asserting his dominion, thereby charting a new locus of sovereignty from that wielded by established lords situated inland. We therefore need to see the encounter engendering a spatial reconfiguration of power that eventually led to the emergence of new breakaway polities whose very origins and cultural logic resided principally in the expanding Atlantic context. These moments then need to be reintegrated into the history of the encounter and into the political history of both African and European states. The earliest encounters between Europeans and Africans embodied more than an aberrant yet overlooked moment in the long history of the slave trade. In an age marked by